Chapter 2, it's really kind of a second intro. Chapter 3 and 4, that's when we get into infancy and we really get into what people think of as developmental psychology. You can look at those PowerPoints now if you want. 3 is the biological and cognitive for infancy, and then 4 is the social emotional for infancy. In this chapter, we'll talk about, in chapter 2, we'll talk a little bit about evolutionary psychology. We'll talk a little bit about genes, talk about nature and nurture, and a little bit on prenatal development. For the evolutionary perspective, 2 things to talk about right off the bat. Natural selection. So the best adapted for an environment are the ones to survive and then to reproduce and pass on their genes. That's natural selection. And adaptive behavior is something that promotes survival in the specific habitat that you are in. So, natural selection, adaptive behaviors. Evolutionary psychology emphasizes both of those. Adaptation, reproduction, and then the survival of the fittest helps to shape behavior, helps to shape development. Evolutionary psychology also talks about the idea that there are evolved mechanisms that as a species that have evolved over hundreds, thousands of years, but they're not always adaptive in contemporary society. So these mechanisms that have evolved over thousands of years are vastly different in our culture compared to what they would have been, 10,000 years ago. Some of those mechanisms do not work here in this culture, in this time period, compared to, thousands of years ago. You might think about that. What evolved mechanisms aren't working so great in today's world? It's a great discussion question if your groups want to pose that. I can tell you of a couple of examples that evolved mechanisms where they're not always good. Aggression is a good example. There was a study that showed that 1 in 200 men were descendants of Genghis Khan. And so passing on genes, that's adaptive. Survival of the fittest, that's adaptive. The way he went about doing that, though, is going to be heavily frowned on in this society. We don't want people like Genghis Khan running around in our culture. So that's an example of an evolved mechanism not working properly. Eating a lot of sugar, gorging yourself on food. This is an evolved mechanism because you maybe would only eat once a day, once every other day. So you would eat a lot in one sitting. And so now some of us, we still eat a lot in one sitting. The problem is that we have 3 or 4 meals a day. And so that's an evolved mechanism that doesn't function properly in this culture. All right. On evaluating evolutionary psychology, just kind of a side note, evolution, it does give us these biological potentials, but it does not dictate, it does not decide our behavior. Genes do not dictate your behavior, but they can influence behavior. Aggression, again, as an example, there's one gene they call the warrior gene. Provocation for these people causes them to be more aggressive quicker than people without the gene on average. The APA, they say that men are not hardwired for aggression. Some men, though, do have genes that make them more apt to rely on aggression as like the first course of action. So it's not to say that it's completely out of their hands and it's hardwired and that there's nothing they can do about it. But as far as that window of response goes for like an act of aggression towards you, their window of response for people who have that gene on average is shorter. And so they don't really get to think through it as well as someone without the gene. So yeah, as far as that window of response, we'll talk a little bit about that later in the book. The idea of being present in your life can expand that window. And if you're not present, if you're not thinking about the present moment, that window can get real short and you're not really thinking through things. Anyways, aggression, not hardwired. Your genes do not dictate if you're going to be aggressive or not, but they can definitely influence it. For evaluating evolutionary psych, the scientific method in evolutionary psychology, some of it is what they call just so stories. So some of the things in evolutionary psych are hard to look at experimentally. Not impossible, but it's just a little bit more difficult. As an example, so according to evolutionary psychology, there's an advantage in spatial skills for men over women, and that may be the result of men needing to go out and track and slay food so that everyone in the tribe survives. It makes sense at an intuitive level, but that is something that's going to be kind of hard to study experimentally. You would have to get, pre-industrial culture and go, run experiments with them. Okay, so that's all for the evolutionary psych stuff. It's really interesting stuff, and if that's something that you're interested in, maybe you can talk about it for a group project later on. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about genetics.